Let's talk about Rambo. First Blood. So First Blood came out in 1982 and is an adaptation of the novel of the same name by David Morrell, and is the story of John Rambo, and is the first in the incredibly successful series of Rambo movies. But it's so weird looking back on this first movie, knowing where this series has gone, and realize that it's way more experimental and deeper than I think a lot of people give it credit for. Because even if you haven't seen any of these Rambo movies, you probably have a rough idea of who Rambo is. It's Sylvester Stallone, it's Rocky. He's got muscles on muscles, and he's this elite fighter, and he'll just kill everybody. He's got a big knife, big guns, and that's just John Rambo. But in this movie, he's not this absurdly muscle-bound action hero. He's actually a very broken, damaged war vet that has all of a sudden found himself the victim of circumstance, and now he's got to fight for his life. And while I haven't read the novel First Blood, I do know that they changed some things here and there, one of which being the character of Teasel. He's a sheriff in this version, where I think he was just a police officer in the book, but they made him a sheriff in the movie so they could have a bit more of a parallel between Robin Hood and the Sheriff of Nottingham with Rambo and Teasel. And as a longtime Robin Hood fan, I do appreciate that kind of parallel, because you do see it. I mean, there's the sheriff, of course, that's pretty on the nose, but Rambo flees into the forest, and that's his Sherwood Forest, I guess, and he has to make traps from scratch, and he's an outlaw. But even with all these parallels, I wouldn't go so far as to call this a Robin Hood adaptation. It uses some ideas from Robin Hood to help tell the story, but it's really its own thing. First Blood, first and foremost, is a Vietnam movie set in America, and it has a surprising amount of subtext for an 80s action movie. This is why I find it strange that the later Rambo movies have taken such a hard turn into the more muscle-bound, cheesy action movie type that Schwarzenegger made extremely popular. But First Blood isn't really about that. It's about the psychology of Vietnam and how returning veterans weren't appreciated or even welcomed when they came back from Vietnam. They were called baby killers and so many other derogatory terms. And this movie does such a great job of exploring through the character of John Rambo, someone who was in Vietnam, was so efficient at killing and doing pretty horrific things that when he came back to the States, there was no place for him. He can't hold down a job. He's got extreme PTSD. And it's the way that this movie handles its subject matter that separates it from a lot of action movies at the time. It makes it feel a bit more experimental, like they were really trying to say something with this movie. And I think it works. And it's the way this movie handles its heavier subject matter that makes this movie feel less like a traditional action movie and a bit more experimental. It actually feels more like a 70s movie in that regard than an 80s movie. The 70s was very experimental. You didn't have traditional good guys and bad guys. You had these weird kind of anti-heroes that were broken and corrupt and weren't great people, but they still did what they thought was right. Think like Charles Bronson in Death Wish or Robert De Niro in Taxi Driver. Stallone in this movie feels a lot more at home with those guys than someone like Schwarzenegger in Commando. And it's here where Sylvester Stallone's acting really does shine. He does a good job as Rambo. Now, Stallone's career has not always been the most critically acclaimed. There are some movies where he really hams it up, like in Judge Dredd. But here you get a sense that Stallone is actually a good actor. You get it a little bit in the first couple Rockies, but here in First Blood, he really brings it. He does a great job with this kind of damaged warrior persona, and he handles the PTSD elements really well. And when he has his big emotional breakdown at the end in front of Troutman, and you feel so bad for Rambo because he's been through hell. He's been through hell in Vietnam, he's been through hell in America, and you just want this guy to get a little bit of peace. But as great as Stallone is in this movie, and as important as it is to get that element right about Rambo, the supporting cast also does a pretty good job. They bring in Colonel Troutman, the man who recruited and trained and fought in Vietnam with John Rambo, to try to get him out of the woods, to try to calm him down and negotiate with him, basically, and try to dissolve this whole situation. And Richard Crenna does a great job as Troutman. I think he does a little bit better in the second movie. I think they give him a bit more to do. But here he's perfectly fine. His job in this movie is basically just to keep telling the sheriff that he's too prideful, that Rambo is just going to kill everybody if you try to take him by force, and you need to just coax Rambo into giving himself up. That's the only way the sheriff and his deputies are going to survive this whole situation. And he does a good job at bringing some needed backstory into Rambo to talk about his experiences in Vietnam and talk about Rambo's skills, so when we see Rambo pulling out these crazy camouflage maneuvers and all kinds of stuff, it makes sense because it's been established that Rambo is this super elite fighter. Because early on in this movie, Rambo doesn't do anything too crazy. I mean, he does escape the police and escape the town pretty easily, but he doesn't do anything too crazy. He just steals a motorbike, goes into the woods. And while this is a pretty intense chase and it is a good, well-filmed action sequence, it doesn't scream special forces to me. It just screams like, okay, this guy has a lot of military training and knows what he's doing. But a bit later, the action scenes get a little more intense and we get a little more background in who Rambo is and that he was special forces, he was the best of the best. And you see him covering himself in mud and twigs and camouflaging. And there's a really cool shot where he is there just in the corner of the frame, and he's there for a pretty long time. It's a relatively long take, and he's there for the entire shot. And you don't know he's there until he jumps out. But he is there the whole time. He's just that well camouflaged. And from his moments of camouflage to the traps that he's set, to how he's able to hunt and build shelter in the mine to sustain himself, to just his general resourcefulness, how he uses his knife for really any purpose. His knife is like MacGyver's Swiss Army knife. He can use it for all kinds of stuff. He even uses it as a torch at one point, and he sticks it into the wall so he can see better. And while I'm talking about the action, logistically, there is one shot that stands out to me as just a nearly impossible shot to get. It must have been so hard to set this up and execute it. It's when Rambo is hiding behind a tree and there's a helicopter looking for him, and the helicopter is in the shot and it's going from one side of the tree to the other side of the tree and then back to the first side. And the camera is following all this action. It's panning from side to side, but at the same time it's keeping both the helicopter in frame and Rambo in frame. And just to choreograph the helicopter to be in the frame so that it didn't drift from one side to the other too much, that is probably the most impressive feat of movie making in this whole movie. But as much as I love this movie, there is just one aspect that I think they kind of missed out on as far as character development, and that is with the Sheriff Teasel, played by Brian Dennehy. Now, Dennehy does a good job with what he's given. I think he was the right person to cast. He's supposed to be this very prideful sheriff with a chip on his shoulder, and Rambo's just irritating the crap out of him because he can't catch him. And as an antagonist to Rambo, and even as a Sheriff of Nottingham allegory, he works for it. And the scenes between the sheriff and the colonel where they're talking about Rambo and talking about different ways to catch him, it's very good and interesting and relatable and makes sense. The only thing that they forgot to include was why the sheriff has a chip on his shoulder to begin with. Now, the sheriff seems to be doing all right for himself. Everybody in the town likes him. They all know him. He's the staple of the town. Everything seems to be pretty chill. That is until Rambo starts drifting into town, and for some reason that really upsets this sheriff, and we never really understand why. Why does this guy hate Rambo so much? Why does just Rambo's presence irritate him so much? Is it because he's young? Is it because he's former military? Is it the fact that Rambo's knife is bigger than his? We don't know. And while his motivation is never really spelled out, there are moments of intrigue where you feel like you almost get it. There's a scene where him and Troutman are talking in a restaurant about Rambo and about military service and the fact that he's got it all here. He can go back to his wife and kids and the white picket fence, and Troutman seems a little irritated by that. He doesn't give a response. He just kind of sighs. So are we supposed to take that as that he doesn't have this white picket fence life? Because everything we've seen from him would suggest so, but his lack of a response seems to indicate that there is something deeper going on with him that the movie never really addresses. Did his wife leave him because of the job? Did his wife leave him for another man that might have matched Rambo's general description, maybe a military man? Did he have some incident with another veteran drifter that came into town that really caused some problems? It's never explained, and here I am reaching for straws to try to just connect this character motivation. But as great as this movie is with its metaphors and subtext and layered characters and Vietnam allegories, it really missed the boat on Teasel's character. And it's even more frustrating because we do get to spend a lot of time with Teasel and Troutman, probably more so than with Rambo, because for most of the movie he's just by himself kind of living out in the woods. so we need something more interesting to cut back to. And in all of their conversations and in all of his scenes, we still don't get that information. And it's such an easy fix too, like just throw in some throwaway dialogue about his life or something that happened recently or something to get that chip on his shoulder, why he's so prideful and thinks that he can handle it himself when everything Rambo's done so far in the movie proves that he can't do it himself. Rambo is just too powerful. But aside from that one glaring issue, the movie really is very thoughtful in its characterizations. Like I said before, there's a lot of subtext here. You can look at this as a commentary on how vets were treated when they came back from the war, or you could also look at this as the veterans' revenge against the people that didn't support them in the war. Because of all the wars America's gotten involved in, Vietnam was probably one of the most protested, and a lot of people in America had some very strong opinions about what they should be doing in Vietnam, how it should be handled, without actually being in the thick of it. It's a different perspective when you're sitting on your couch at home and you're watching it on TV, watching the news cycle and seeing all this stuff versus actually being in there and having to make those very hard calls in the moment. And I think one way to look at the character of Teasel is as someone who may not have supported the war, but all of a sudden the war came to his own backyard and he's fighting a war that he can't win, just like how America fought a war they couldn't win in Vietnam. So even though Teasel may not have the most fleshed out motivation or backstory, he still does serve the story well in the messages that the movie wants to get across, and it does work. But even if you're not interested in the history and the subtext and really diving into this movie, there are some really amazing stunts here and camera work and set pieces. There's a moment I'll never forget where Rambo is climbing the side of a mountain and he's getting shot at by the helicopter and he's got to jump and he lands on this tree. And it's a really impressive stunt, and Rambo actually takes some damage from that. He's not just Superman. You know, he gets hurt, which is something that happens less and less as these movies progress. But going back to this first movie, it holds up surprisingly well, and its message is still surprisingly relevant with war and PTSD and how we treat our veterans when we come home. And if you've never seen it, go check it out. If you haven't seen it in a while, watch it again. If you've only seen the later Rambo movies, watch this first one, and you will see a very stark contrast in both tone and character. But now I turn it over to you guys. What do you think about First Blood? Did you think it was too slow and not enough action compared to the later movies, or do you like the more thoughtful, deep meta commentary that this movie brings? Whatever you think, comment below, and if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.